No shoes, no shirt, no service. You've, I'm sure, seen those signs on doors of businesses and whatnot. You probably haven't seen that sign yet on our church building. You're not going to see that sign, I don't think. But you know, it can make us think about where we are welcome and where we're not. When we're able to be included, or if we're going to be excluded. If we show up somewhere without a shirt on, we may well find ourselves excluded and feel ourselves not welcome. Personally, it would be no problem for me, because I can't stand going shirtless anyway, being very self-conscious, and maybe you have the same feeling that you don't really want to show up that way anyway. But you know, it makes us think about inclusion, exclusion, and who's welcome, who's not. And as I was thinking about this recently, and especially on Remembrance Day, as we went as a family to the Remembrance Day service in Colborne, and with our youngest son, who is now part of the Air Force. And so this was our first time really seeing him there in uniform. We did get to see him graduate from basic training in uniform, but here he was out in public in uniform. And that made me think of back when I wore a uniform in Air Cadets. Spent maybe 4 or 5 years in Air Cadets and then half a year in the militia. Wearing uniform, and that was part of it, was you were welcome to join, but to be included, you had to wear the uniform, and also had to get my hair cut. Now Aidan, he got his hair cut just before he went to basic training, and then was there maybe 1 day or 2 days, and he got his hair cut again. So the first one was rather pointless, but certain standards that if you don't sign up for them, then you're going to be excluded. You're not going to be a part. You're not going to be included in Air Cadets if you're not willing to wear the uniform. Do we get like that as churches? That unless you're wearing the right uniform, of course I wasn't thinking Salvation Army today, was I? Unless you're wearing the right uniform, you're not part of us. Unless there's something about you that isn't just like us, then you're not. And that's what the uniform is about, right? It's about uniformity. Uniformity. And do we do that as churches? That unless there's a sense of uniformity about your behavior, then you're not part of us, you're not included. And maybe at times in history we've had certain things that you had to sign up about yourself, that yes, I would, you know, for Baptists don't dance, right? Right. Well, at certain points in history that would be actually correct. Baptists don't dance. If you're a good Baptist, you don't dance, and if you do dance, you really can't be included. And maybe the best Baptists of all would say, not only shouldn't you be included in Baptists, you shouldn't even consider yourself a Christian. Maybe that could happen. And Baptists don't drink, right? Well, there again, sometimes there has been, well, even with some churches, that you really had to sign on the dotted line that you wouldn't. We don't do that anymore. But this idea of who's included, who's in, who's out. And it has this idea of uniformity about it. It's like you have to put on the right uniform to be considered as part of us. Maybe at certain times in your life you've made to be feel like you don't belong, like you're not included. And maybe sometimes in your life, and maybe my life too, as I reflect on it, maybe sometimes we've made others feel like they don't belong, that they're not included. Well, Jesus opens us up to thinking about these things this morning as we look at our scripture focus. As we think about that story of his calling of Matthew, who is a tax collector. And Matthew throws this party for Jesus and invites all his friends. And guess what? All of his friends are tax collectors, naturally, and other members of what you'd know as the riffraff. People who maybe didn't belong in good religious circles, and here they are hanging out with Jesus, and Jesus is hanging out with them, with the riffraff, and eating with them. And so the Pharisees, they take exception to this, and they say to the disciples, why does your master, why does Jesus eat with these people, with these tax collectors and with these sinners? Now we should recognize that back in that day, to eat with somebody was a sign of respect, a sign of solidarity, a sign of, you and I, we're not so different, are we? Let's be together. It was a sign of something, of welcome. And so Jesus would sit and eat with these tax collectors and others known as sinners. Now, tax collectors, why was that so disgusting? Well, for one thing, here's Jesus sitting with people who were considered sinful by most people. Why? Well, it's obvious. They collected taxes, right? And anybody that collects his taxes off is sinful for doing so, right? Well, in that day, they didn't have to keep a ledger in the same way that tax collectors would today. It wasn't all computerized back then, right? So as long as Rome, and keep in mind here that the taxes are being collected for Rome, who is an occupying force here in Judah, collecting taxes for Rome, as long as Rome got their money, they didn't care if the tax collectors got a little too much for themselves. So it was widely perceived that the tax collectors would actually get too much for themselves, and therefore would be exploiting the situation that they were able to get more money off of these people. And so this idea of being greedy, and so therefore they're looked down upon as being sinful, especially by Pharisees, especially by the religious leaders who are calling the people, of course, to be good, to follow the law perfectly so that God would come and rescue Israel from Rome. Keep that in mind for a little later. But for now, here are these Pharisees looking down on these people as being sinful. And here is Jesus. The Pharisees wouldn't sit and eat with these tax collectors, but Jesus did. Jesus did. And so Jesus was willing to sit at the table with sinners. Not only was he willing to sit at the table with sinners, he was also willing to sit at the table with people who thought differently. Now let's think about these tax collectors again. Is it the case that every tax collector had an evil bent? Weren't there at least some decent tax collectors who wouldn't exploit the situation? I got to think there's probably some decent people there. Humanity is made up of people who try and be decent, and sometimes it seems like humanity is made up of people that don't try and are not decent. There's a bit of both, and that's always been the case. And so as we think back to those tax collectors, surely there were some who really weren't sinful in being greedy. Yet, they're still despised because they were thinking differently than the Pharisees. For the Pharisees, the problem is of Rome. There's this problem of Rome. Here are the Romans, they're everywhere, and they're in charge of our nation, Judah, back in that day. And that's not the way it's supposed to be. So according to the Pharisees, the way you deal with that is you follow the law correctly, and then God will come and deal with the Romans. Now there's other groups like the Zealots. The way you deal with the Romans is let's get our arms together and let's beat up the Romans and fight for our freedom. The tax collectors, on the other hand, what are they doing? Collecting taxes for Rome. Notice the different thinking that would be involved there on the tax collectors than the Pharisees. The Pharisees are like, have nothing to do with Rome. They're the problem. The tax collectors, on the other hand, are thinking, well, the Romans are here, so they're collecting taxes from us, and they're using those taxes to build better roads. And who builds better roads than the Romans? And sometimes I drive on potholed roads here in Canada, and I wish the Romans would come and build some roads for us. But the Romans were actually doing some good things in the nations that they invaded and took over, but they would actually do some good things and build some good institutions that were good. Now, of course, it was always better for those who were A, Roman, and B, male, and all kinds of things like that. But there is a sense for some of the people, at least, in the land of, well, let's just get along with the Romans. Let's do the best we can with it. In fact, some would be able to make the case. Now, I don't think there's any evidence of this happening, but I could see it happening. Some looking to the book of Jeremiah, the prophecy of Jeremiah, and saying, look, back in Jeremiah's day when we were exiled to Babylon, and Jeremiah was saying, settle down and pray for the peace of Babylon. Pray for the prosperity of Babylon, because if things go well for Babylon, our invaders, things will go well for us. So settle down, make your homes there, and just settle in and be good citizens there in Babylon. And so in our day, as we have Romans in charge of us in Judah here, the best thing, if we want to be biblical, what we can do is pray for the peace of Rome. And just settle in with the Romans and do the best we can under their thumb. But let's be like Jeremiah in his day. That's the biblical thing to do. So there's that opinion contrasted with the opinion of the Pharisees. If we want to be biblical, then we need to pray that God comes and beats these Romans up. Of course, God does come. Does he beat the Romans up? No, he's crucified by the Romans, and through that shows incredible love for both the Jew and the Roman alike, for all people, showing a different way and showing grace that all alike, both Jew and Roman alike, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. But thanks be to God for his grace that he would die for both. So here we have Romans, as Jesus is hanging out with these tax collectors. We have the Pharisees saying, don't collude with the Romans, don't collect taxes for them, thinking differently than the tax collectors who are like, well, no, this is what we're supposed to do, to be good people. The situation there, when you have these two very separate groups and this polarity between these two groups, it's almost like they're living in America today with the Republicans and the Democrats, right? That's what the polarization is like there. Thinking very polar opposites, and more opposite than ever, it seems, and both tying in religion and politics together. No, we are Republicans because it's the Jesus thing to do. No, we are Democrats because it's the Jesus thing to do. Both parties do that. And we don't have that to the same extent in Canada, but we do have it a wee bit. We do believe in separation of church and state, but our theology and the way we think about how God moves in the world does affect how we operate in the world and the politics that we use. That's natural. But the point here is that though the Republicans won't sit with the Democrats and the Democrats with the Republicans, no, actually, though the Pharisees won't sit with and have a meal with and sit at the table with the tax collectors, and though the tax collectors won't sit with and have a meal with the Pharisees, Jesus will have a meal and sit with the tax collectors, and Jesus will also sit with and have a meal with the Pharisees. And so Jesus doesn't just welcome sinners, he also welcomes people who think differently. Maybe from himself, but also from each other. He welcomes those who are diverse in their opinions and what they think about things. And so what about us? Do we do that? Are we like Jesus in that? The other thing we see about Jesus, and this isn't just true of him being with the tax collectors here, but true of his ministry overall, he's one that would invite people to draw closer to him. What we can sometimes do is invite people to join our party, to join our system, to join our people, to wear our uniform, to join us on this side of the fence that we've put up. That's what we sometimes do, as we put up a fence and invite people to join us on this side of the fence. That's not what Jesus was doing. He was inviting people to draw close to him. And so you have Zacchaeus, a tax collector, whose life was changed by Jesus, yet as far as we know, he still collected taxes. You have Nicodemus, a Pharisee, whose life was changed by Jesus, and yet as far as we know, he remained a Pharisee. Jesus didn't put up fences and then say, okay, join me on this side of the fence, but he just invited people to draw closer. Do we do that? Do we invite people to walk with Jesus in faith, hope, and love? Or do we set up fences and say, to be a part of us, you need to hop over that fence? We did have a vote yesterday at the Trent Valley Association, and to bring forward this covenant. And it needed a 2/3 majority to pass, and it got 2% over the 2/3 majority. That is so close a vote. But basically what that covenant has done is further defined us as this is the uniform we wear. This is the uniform we expect you to wear if you are a Baptist in our association. We're on a series, what kind of church? Are we the kind of church that sets those kind of fences? That gets so specific in setting what this uniform must look like that you wear? Or are we the kind of church that wants to be, I think, more like Jesus in inviting people to draw close? And let's not talk about fences, let's just draw close. That's the emphasis we see in the New Testament. People either are drawing closer to Jesus, or they're pushing Jesus away. And I think we're onto a beautiful thing of helping people walk with Jesus. Draw close to Jesus. Yet as Jesus invites people close, we want to recognize too that it's not anything goes. It might seem like it. I mean, here's the reputation he got. The Son of Man came eating and drinking. Now this is Jesus referring to himself. I, the Son of Man, came eating and drinking, and they say, look, a glutton and a drunkard. Isn't that amazing that that's the reputation that Jesus had? A glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. Yet wisdom is vindicated by her deeds, Jesus said. Look at the reputation of Jesus. One who hangs out with tax collectors and sinners. So it might seem like anything goes, right? Well, there is a call to follow. Let me read this story to you. What do you think? A man had 2 sons. He went to the first and said, son, go and work in the vineyard today. He answered, I will not. But later he changed his mind and went. The father went to the second and said the same. And he answered, I go, sir. But then he did not go. Which of the 2 did the will of his father? They said, the first. Jesus said to them, and keep in mind he's speaking to the religious leaders here, truly I tell you, the tax collectors and the prostitutes are going into the kingdom of God ahead of you. For John came to you in the way of righteousness, and you did not believe him. But the tax collectors and the prostitutes believed him. And even after you saw it, you did not change your minds and believe him. In other words, the religious leaders, they were pushing Jesus away, and when Jesus wouldn't go away, they made him go away by crucifying him, right? Pushing him away, pushing away from him, crucifying him. But Jesus, of course, wouldn't go away. He rose from the dead. He's not going away. He's not going anywhere. But as he says, the tax collectors and the prostitutes, they were drawing close to him. They were pursuing him. They were seeking to follow him. Who's in, who's out? Who cares? Who's Jesus and how can we follow him? Who's Jesus and how can we draw close to him? Who's Jesus? How can we walk with him? And some of us may look like sinners when we do that. And some of us may think differently from one another as we do that. But are we drawing close to Jesus? We're in the series, What Kind of Church? And we're looking at open table communities, which, as you can probably gather, is an open table. Tax collectors would be welcome at the open table communities. And so the cultural statement today is a culture of hospitality. We nurture a culture of openness to everyone, including those who are different from us. This is accomplished through opening up our lives and our homes to others. We choose to live in the tensions that come with inclusion rather than the barriers created by exclusion. There's a lot to think about in that statement. There's a lot to think about. What does it mean to be a follower of Jesus and to be a community of Jesus followers? Are we being like Christ? Are there tax collectors and sinners amongst us? Well, definitely there is, because I don't collect taxes, but I am a sinner, just as you are. There, but by the grace of God, go we. Where would we be without God's grace and love for who we are?